What if the most valuable thing in the world wasn't buried in a vault, locked behind iron bars, or guarded by 100 armed men, but sitting in a busted, rotting suitcase at an estate sale in the middle of nowhere, priced at $70, while everyone around it laughed? That's where this story begins. Not in a bank, not in a saloon, in the dust. And the man who bought it? Nobody knew his name yet. But they would. Part 1. The man nobody noticed. It was a Tuesday morning in the fall of 1882, and the town of Red Rock Flats, Nevada, smelled like horse sweat and old leather. It wasn't the kind of town you'd find on a map unless you were already lost. A few hundred souls, a general store with a crooked sign, 2 saloons that stayed busy even when the church didn't, and a sheriff who was more interested in his lunch than in the law. The Hargrove estate sale had been advertised in 3 counties. Old Elias Hargrove had died without a will, without children, and without much of anything worth fighting over. At least, that's what the men circling his property believed that morning. They picked through iron pots, saddles with cracked stitching, moth-eaten blankets, and furniture that looked like it had survived both a fire and a flood, but not gracefully. In the corner of the barn, past a rusted plow and a stack of warped timber, sat a suitcase. It wasn't pretty. The leather was split along the left side. One clasp was missing entirely. The other was locked shut, and nobody had the key. Somebody had dragged it into the corner like they didn't want to look at it. It sat in the dark, like a thing that had given up on being found. Thomas Reel noticed it. He wasn't from Red Rock Flats. He'd ridden in 2 days before, said he was passing through, paid for a room above the saloon with a handful of coins that clinked like he counted them twice. He was somewhere between 30 and 40, with the kind of face that didn't give you much information. Brown hair going gray at the temples, hands that were calloused but careful, eyes that moved over a room the way a hunting dog moves through tall grass. He picked up the suitcase and shook it. There was weight inside, not a lot, but something. He set it back down and tilted it toward the light from the barn door. The leather was cracked, yes, but under the dirt, the stitching was unusual, tight and even, done with a waxed thread he hadn't seen outside of the East Coast. The hardware, even with the missing clasp, was solid brass. Old brass, not the cheap alloy stuff they'd started selling out of St. Louis. The man running the sale, a heavy-set fellow named Burl Cotter, who was more auctioneer than appraiser, sauntered over and looked at Thomas looking at the suitcase. "You interested in that thing?" Burl said, like he was asking if Thomas was interested in a dead rat. "Might be," Thomas said. "Can't open it." "Nobody can. Lock's seized up or broken or something. We don't even know what's in it. Probably nothing." Burl kicked the suitcase lightly with the toe of his boot. Old Elias was a hoarder and a half. Man kept everything, probably full of newspaper clippings and broken watch parts. "What do you want for it?" Burl squinted. $70. There was a pause. 2 men standing nearby stopped pretending to look at a saddle. "70, one of them said, almost laughing. "For a box you can't even open?" "Take it or leave it," Burl said with a shrug, but he was watching Thomas carefully. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and counted out $70 in mixed bills and coin. He handed it to Burl. He picked up the suitcase. The 2 men by the saddle looked at each other, then at Burl, then at Thomas walking out of the barn. One of them started laughing. Not hard, but the kind of laugh you use when you think somebody else just got taken. "Boy's got more money than sense," the other one said. Thomas Reel walked to his horse, tied the suitcase to the back of the saddle with a length of rope he'd kept coiled at his hip, and rode out of town before noon. He didn't look back. Part 2. What the suitcase held. He rode until dusk, until the flat Nevada scrubland gave way to a canyon wall that blocked the wind. He made camp the way experienced men make camp, without ceremony, without waste. Fire small, bedroll near the horse. Food simple. He didn't open the suitcase until the fire was low and the stars were out. He sat with it in his lap and looked at the lock. It was a 5-pin tumbler mechanism. He could tell by the faceplate and the keyway. Expensive for 1882. The kind of lock that didn't come standard on travel luggage. Somebody had replaced the original latch with this one deliberately. He'd been a locksmith in another life, or part of one anyway. He'd learned in Philadelphia, in a shop on Walnut Street run by a German immigrant named Vogt, who believed that understanding how things locked was the beginning of understanding how anything worked. Thomas hadn't stayed long enough to finish his apprenticeship. The war pulled him west, like it pulled everything west. But the skills stayed. He worked with a pair of small picks he kept in a folded leather pouch. Not criminal tools, he'd told himself many times. Just mechanical knowledge. It took him 40 minutes. The lock was seized, just like Burl Cotter had said, but not broken. Dust and oxidation. He worked it gently, applying pressure in the right sequence, coaxing the pins up in the right order, feeling the mechanism the way a doctor feels a pulse. The lock turned. He opened the suitcase, and the first thing he saw was a map. Not a printed map. A hand-drawn map, in ink that had faded to brown, on paper that was thick and waxy, and had survived whatever the suitcase had been through. The map showed a stretch of landscape he didn't immediately recognize. A canyon system, a dry riverbed, something labeled Morrow Creek in cramped handwriting, and an X. Not a dramatic X with a circle around it, just a small, careful X at the bend of a dry creek with a number beside it. 3,000. Below the map, in the same handwriting, were the words. Below the flat stone. Left bank. Count 12 paces from the juniper. He looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at what else was in the suitcase. There were letters, 7 of them, bound with twine. He untied them and read them by firelight. They were written to someone named Hargrove, which tracked, since he'd bought the suitcase at the Hargrove estate. But the Hargrove being written to wasn't Elias. It was a man named Clayton Hargrove, and the letters were dated between 1867 and 1871. The letters were from a man who signed himself only as DWDW, wrote like a man who had seen things that changed the shape of his thinking. He wrote about the war, the one that had ended 2 years before his first letter, in a way that wasn't nostalgic or proud. He wrote about it like a wound that never closed. He'd served in the Union Army, 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and he'd come home to find that the things he'd left behind weren't waiting for him anymore. But the money was. That's what DW called it. The money. Not my money, just the money. Like it belonged to no one, or like it had its own identity. In the 4th letter, dated March of 1869, DW described where he'd put it. Nevada, near a place the Paiute called the Dry Teeth, a series of flat-topped rock formations along a creek that only ran during the spring snowmelt. He'd buried it there, under a flat stone, on the left bank of Morrow Creek, 12 paces from a juniper he'd notched with his knife. He'd drawn the map, put it in the suitcase with the letters, and given it to Clayton Hargrove for safekeeping. He never came back for it. The last letter, from 1871, was short. It said, "I don't expect to survive the winter. The sickness has hold of me, and I won't try to outrun it. Whatever is in that creek is yours now, Clayton. You were the only honest man I ever knew. Use it for something that deserves it." There was no signature. Just D.W. Thomas Reel sat for a while with the letters in his hands and the fire dying beside him. $3,000. In 1882, $3,000 was not a fortune that changed dynasties, but it was a fortune that changed lives. A working cowhand made $30 a month if he was lucky. $3,000 was nearly 8.5 years of wages. It was a house. It was a start over. It was the difference between the life you were living and a different kind of life. He put the letters back in the suitcase. He put the map in his coat pocket, folded twice. He closed the suitcase, relocked it out of habit, and set it against the canyon wall. He looked at the stars for a long time. Then he made a decision that told you everything you needed to know about who Thomas Reel actually was. Part 3. The Road to Morrow Creek. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. And if you're thinking Thomas just rode straight to that creek, dug up $3,000, and rode into the sunset, you don't know much about the West, and you don't know much about what happens when old money sits in the ground long enough to collect enemies. Because there were others who knew about the money. Not about the map, not about the letters, but about the money itself. Elias Hargrove, the dead man whose estate sale had put the suitcase up for sale, hadn't been as clueless about the suitcase's contents as Burl Cotter believed. He'd known it existed. He'd known his cousin Clayton had kept it. And when Clayton died in 1877, the suitcase had passed to Elias. Not opened, not discussed, just inherited along with everything else. But Elias had talked. Old men do, especially when they drink. At least 3 people in Red Rock Flats had heard Elias Hargrove mention, over the course of several whiskey-soaked evenings, that his cousin Clayton had been holding something for a dead soldier, and that whatever it was worth finding. One of those 3 people was a man named Cord Lester. Cord Lester was the kind of man the West produced in abundance during those years. Smart enough to be dangerous, loyal only to himself, and patient in the way that predators are patient. He worked as a hired hand at various ranches, showed up when money was needed, disappeared when it wasn't. He had a partner named Fitch, who was less smart but made up for it by being willing to do things most men wouldn't. Cord had not bothered with the estate sale. He'd known the suitcase would be there, but he'd also known he couldn't open the lock. He'd tried once, 2 years earlier, when Elias had shown it to him in a moment of drunken bragging, and the lock had refused him. He figured whoever bought it for a fool's price would do the hard work, and then he'd follow. He'd been at the estate sale that morning. He'd watched Thomas Reel count out $70. And then he'd followed. Part 4. The Canyon at Night. Thomas was 3 days into his ride toward the canyon system he'd identified from the map when he noticed the 2 riders behind him. He'd noticed them on the first day, actually. A smudge of dust 2 or 3 miles back, consistent enough to mean intention. He'd changed his route twice, taken a detour through a dry gulch that added 4 hours to his ride, and the dust was still there. 2 riders. One of them rode like he was tired. The other rode like a man who'd been riding his whole life and never once thought about it. Thomas didn't panic. Panic was expensive. He made camp that night in a small box canyon, a place where the walls narrowed to about 30 feet across, and the back wall was sheer rock. One entrance, no exits except up. It was the kind of campsite a careful man chose when he expected company. Not because it was a stronghold, but because anyone approaching would have to come through the one opening, and he'd hear them long before they arrived. He built his fire larger than usual. He boiled coffee he didn't drink. He made himself visible, and he waited. They came at 2 in the morning. He heard the horses first, the soft hoof falls on dry rock, the occasional chink of a bit. He was already sitting up, back against the canyon wall, rifle across his knees, when Cord Lester and Fitch rode into the circle of firelight. Cord pulled up his horse 20 feet away. Fitch stopped beside him. "Evening," Cord said, with the kind of easy tone that wasn't easy at all. "Mind if we share your fire?" "I mind," Thomas said. Cord looked at him. Thomas looked at Cord. The fire crackled between them. "That's a shame," Cord said. "Cold night. It'll warm up." There was a silence. Fitch's hand shifted. Thomas's rifle didn't move, but his finger did. "You bought something at the Hargrove sale," Cord said. "I bought several things. The suitcase, among others." Cord smiled. It was the smile of a man who respected another man's nerve, even while he was trying to decide if he needed to shoot him. "Whatever's in that suitcase belongs to people with a prior claim." "That's so," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Elias Hargrove owed a debt. We're collecting. Elias Hargrove is dead. Debts don't die. Thomas let the silence sit for a moment. Then, ride back the way you came. Do it now, and we never have to talk again. Cord studied him. And if we don't, then we'll be talking in a different way, and it'll go worse for everyone involved. Another silence. The fire shifted, throwing new shadows across both men's faces. And here's the thing you need to understand about moments like this in the West. They were never as romantic as the stories made them. They were cold and tired and smelled like horse and sweat. And the men in them were mostly just trying to calculate whether the thing they wanted was worth the cost of getting it. Right now, in the dark, against a man who might be faster or luckier or just more stubborn than they'd accounted for. Cord Lester looked at Thomas Reel for another 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Fitch followed without a word. Thomas didn't sleep that night. Fort. Morrow Creek. He found the creek on the 4th day. It was dry, it was October, long past the snowmelt. But he recognized the landscape from the map. The flat-topped rock formations the Paiute called the Dry Teeth rose on the western side in a jagged line against a pale sky. The creek bed was a white scar of dry gravel cutting through the scrub. He rode along the left bank for 2 hours before he found the juniper. It was old, thick-trunked, twisted, the way junipers get when they've been fighting wind and drought for a century or more. And there, low on the trunk, nearly healed over by bark, but still visible if you knew what you were looking for. A notch. Deep. Made with a sharp knife by a man who'd wanted it to last. He tied his horse to the tree. He walked 12 paces along the left bank, counting carefully. He found a flat stone. It was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 4 feet across, thick, settled deep into the earth. He worked it loose with a crowbar he'd bought 2 days earlier at a supply post, levering it up and rolling it aside. Beneath it, a tin box, sealed with tar around the lid. He sat down in the dry creek bed and held the box in his lap. It wasn't a dramatic moment. The sky was gray. There was a hawk somewhere overhead. His horse stamped and blew. He was tired and dusty and hadn't slept properly in 4 days. He pried the lid off with his knife. Inside, bills wrapped in oilskin, gold coin stacked in paper rolls, a total of $2,940. Not quite $3,000, because DW had apparently spent $60 of it before he buried the rest, and he'd noted this in a small piece of paper tucked under the oilskin. Spent 60 in Reno. Couldn't help it. Sorry. Thomas Reel laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in a week, and it came out strange. Too loud for the empty canyon, too bright for the gray sky, but it was real. He sat there for a while in the dry creek bed, with $2,940 in a tin box under a twisted juniper in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, on a Tuesday in October. And then he made the decision that had been building since the night he'd first read those letters by firelight. Part 6. The honest thing now. Before you assume you know what Thomas Reel did next, I want you to think about what you actually know about this man. You know he was careful. You know he was skilled. You know he'd ridden into danger without flinching and out of it without bragging. You know he had calloused hands and careful eyes and a gun he hadn't fired at anyone yet, though the option had been available. What you don't know, what nobody in Red Rock Flats knew, what Cord Lester didn't know, what Burl Cotter certainly didn't know, was that Thomas Reel had grown up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, in a house where his father had worked as a postal inspector for 22 years, and where the concept of something belonging to someone was not abstract. It was the foundation. Thomas Reel did not keep the money. He found out, through the letters, through some careful inquiry he'd been doing along the way, that D.W. had a name, Daniel Whitmore. And Daniel Whitmore had a sister still living. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 53 years old. She lived in Carson City, Nevada. She'd been told her brother died in 1871, which was true, but nobody had told her he'd left anything behind. He rode to Carson City. It took 4 more days. Cord, Lester, and Fitch tried twice more to intercept him, once at a river crossing, once outside a small settlement called Mira Junction. Both times, they backed down. Either Cord had revised his cost calculation, or something about Thomas's refusal to be rattled had convinced him the outcome of a direct confrontation wasn't going to go the way he wanted. He knocked on Ruth Calloway's door on a Saturday morning. She answered in an apron, with the look of a woman who had been working since before dawn and expected to work until after dark. He told her about her brother, about the letters, about the money. She stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "He always said he'd make it right." "He tried," Thomas said. He handed her the tin box. Part 7. What followed? Here's something the stories don't always tell you about the Old West. Justice, when it came, usually came slow and sideways. Thomas Reel didn't get a parade. He didn't get a deed to a ranch. What he got was a cup of coffee at Ruth Calloway's kitchen table, a long conversation about her brother's life, and 2 weeks later, a letter that reached him at a rooming house in Reno. Ruth had consulted a lawyer. The lawyer had pointed out that Thomas had purchased the suitcase legally, that the contents, legally speaking, were his. She wanted him to take a portion of the money. She wouldn't say how much in the letter. She asked him to come back to Carson City. He didn't go back right away. First, he went back to Red Rock Flats. He found Burl Cotter at the general store and told him, without fanfare or drama, that the suitcase had contained documents of some value, and that he felt Cotter deserved to know. Cotter asked how much value. Thomas didn't answer that directly. He bought a hat from the store instead. A good one, wide-brimmed, the kind that lasted. And he left. He left because Cord Lester was in Red Rock Flats. Word gets around. That's another thing the stories don't emphasize enough. The West was enormous, but the people in it were not spread as thin as the landscape suggested. Word traveled on horses and in letters, and in the mouths of people at supply posts and river crossings. By the time Thomas had made it back to Red Rock Flats, enough people knew enough fragments of the story that the full truth was probably already assembling itself in the minds of a dozen men who might act on it. Cord Lester met him outside the saloon. No gun drawn, no ultimatum. Just 2 men standing on a dirt street in the low afternoon light of a Nevada October. "You gave it away," Cord said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Most of it," Thomas said. Cord stared at him. "Why?" Thomas put on his new hat. "Because it wasn't mine." He walked to his horse. He rode east. Part 8. The Reckoning Now. And here's where I want you to lean in, because this is the part of the story that most people miss. Thomas Reel's decision to return that money didn't make him safe. It made him famous in a very specific, very dangerous way. In the West of 1882, a man who turned down $3,000 was either crazy or a saint, and both crazy men and saints attracted attention from people who had nothing but bad intentions. The story of the suitcase, the estate sale, the $70 purchase, the locked case, the buried money, the widow in Carson City, spread through the Nevada territory like water through cracked rock. Slow at first, then faster, finding every low place. And it attracted a man named Aldous Pike. If Cord Lester was a predator who at least operated on logic, Aldous Pike was something else. He was 51 years old, had served time in 2 states for fraud and 1 for assault, and had spent the last several years operating a scheme that would be called, in more modern language, a confidence operation. He found men with stories, specifically men with stories about found money, and he found ways to separate those men from whatever they'd found. He was very good at it. Pike arrived in Reno in December of 1882. He dressed well, better than anyone had a right to in the Nevada Territory in December, and he spoke like an educated man, which he nearly was. He tracked down Thomas Reel through a combination of inquiries that sounded like casual interest. He found Thomas at a small boarding house on the east edge of town. He introduced himself as a solicitor from San Francisco, representing the estate of one Daniel Whitmore, recently deceased, recently meaning 11 years earlier. And he explained, smoothly and with complete conviction, that there had been a secondary bequest, additional money, not yet discovered, left in a separate location by Whitmore before his death, and that the rightful heir would need a trustworthy intermediary to assist in its recovery for a modest share of the proceeds. Thomas listened to the entire speech. Then he said, Daniel Whitmore had 1 sister and no other heirs. He died in the winter of 1871 in a boarding house in Elko, Nevada. He had no solicitor and no estate. He'd spent his last $60 in Reno and wrote a note apologizing for it. Pike stared at him. "You've done your research," Thomas said, "but not enough of it." He stood up. "If you're still in Reno in the morning," he said, "I'll be speaking to the marshal." Pike left that evening. He was picked up 3 weeks later in Sacramento for a separate scheme entirely. This one involving a faked land deed and a widow with savings. He served 14 months. Thomas Reel collected a portion of the money from Ruth Calloway. She insisted on $500 and wouldn't hear of less, and used it to buy a partnership in a small print shop in Reno. Part 9. The print shop. Of all the things Thomas Reel could have done with $500 in 1883, a print shop was perhaps the last thing anyone expected. But here's what you need to understand about Thomas Reel. He had always been, at his core, a man who believed in information, in the careful transmission of truth from one place to another. His father had been a postal inspector. He himself had trained as a locksmith, a profession rooted in the idea that the right person, with the right knowledge, should be able to access what they were entitled to. And in a territory full of people who were being cheated, swindled, and outmaneuvered by men with more resources and less conscience, a printing press was a form of leverage. The print shop was called the Nevada Clarion, and it was already in operation when Thomas bought his partnership. A small, struggling concern run by a man named Edgar Platt, who had more journalistic ambition than business sense. Thomas brought order. He brought the careful, methodical attention that had let him read a lock in the dark and navigate a half-dozen potential confrontations without a shot fired. He also brought the story of the suitcase. He wrote it himself in the third person, the way a careful man writes about himself when he wants the facts to be told without the sentiment. He described the estate sale, the $70, the locked case, the locked nights, the creek, the buried tin, the widow. He wrote about Cord Lester and Fitch in enough detail that they'd recognize themselves, but not enough that they could prove it. He wrote about Aldous Pike, including the name, because Pike was already in custody, and the truth about him served the public. The article ran in the Nevada Clarion on February 14th, 1883. It was reprinted in 7 other papers within a month. It reached San Francisco. It reached Salt Lake City. It reached Denver. A version of it eventually appeared in a New York paper, though by then, the details had been stretched and colored in the way that stories get stretched. and colored when they travel far enough from their source. But the core of it held. A man had bought a locked suitcase for $70. He had opened it in the dark. He had found a map and a story and a dead soldier's last wish, and he had honored it. For a 10. What it means. Now I want to step back for a second, right here, before we get to the end, and ask you something directly. Because this story isn't just a story about one man and one suitcase in one canyon in 1882 Nevada. It's a story about what you do with information you weren't supposed to have. Thomas Reel could have kept the money, $3,000, or $2,940 to be precise, and nobody would have known. Cord Lester suspected, but Cord didn't know what Thomas had found inside the suitcase or what he'd done with it. Burl Cotter thought he'd sold a fool a box of nothing. The two men at the estate sale who'd laughed, they'd forgotten Thomas Reel's face by the time they'd gotten home for supper. He could have disappeared into the West, the way so many men disappeared into the West, carrying their conscience in a pocket they never opened. He didn't. And here's the part I want you to really think about. And I mean really think about. Because I want to hear what you think in the comments below. Here's the question. Would you have done the same thing? Don't answer fast. Think about it. Think about $70 spent on faith, 4 days of hard riding, 2 attempted robberies, a tin box under a flat stone, $2,940 in oil-soaked bills and gold coin, and a widow in an apron who hadn't expected anything from the world in a long time. Would you have knocked on that door? I want to know. Drop your answer in the comments, because this story is, and I mean this, about something that is very old and still very much alive. The question of what we owe to strangers we will never meet, to people who died before we were born, to the dead soldier who wrote "I couldn't help it," about $60 he spent on God knows what, in Reno in 1869. Part 11. The Suitcase. After the suitcase itself, the falling apart, locked, $70 suitcase from the Hargrove estate sale ended up in the print shop. Thomas Reel kept it on a shelf behind the press. He never explained why to Edgar Platt, who asked exactly once and accepted the non-answer with the good sense of a man who's learned not to press certain questions. It sat there for 11 years. In 1894, a young man came to the Nevada Clarion looking for work as a typesetter. He was 17, from Ohio, and he had the kind of hungry-eyed attention that Thomas had recognized in himself at that age. The look of someone who understood that information was power and was trying to figure out how to get his hands on some. His name was Marcus Webb. Thomas hired him. 3 months into the job, Marcus noticed the suitcase. He asked about it. Thomas told him the whole story, not the version that had run in the papers, not the polished version, but the actual version, the cold October nights, the careful lock-picking, the way the letters had looked in the firelight, the 11-year-old note about the $60 spent in Reno, Ruth Calloway standing in her doorway in an apron, Cord Lester's face when he found out Thomas had given the money away. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, Marcus said, "What happened to Ruth Calloway?" Thomas said, "She bought a house, a proper one with a garden. She wrote me a letter when the first flowers came up in the spring. Said her brother always said he'd make it right." Marcus thought about this. Did he? Thomas Reel looked at the suitcase on the shelf. "Close enough," he said. Part 12. The map. Here is a detail that didn't make it into the newspaper article, that Thomas Reel never told anyone except Marcus Webb, and that I am telling you now because it is the detail that changes everything if you hold it in the right light. The map wasn't drawn by D.W. Thomas had figured this out in the creek bed, sitting in the dry gravel with the tin box in his lap. Before he'd even opened it, he'd pulled the map from his coat pocket. and looked at it in the thin October light. And he'd noticed something that the firelight had hidden the first night. The map was drawn in a different hand than the letters. The letters were in DW's hand, small, cramped, written by a man who learned penmanship in a hurry and never fully relaxed. The map was in a different hand, larger, more deliberate, almost architectural, the handwriting of someone who had been trained in technical drawing. It meant DW hadn't drawn the map himself. Someone else had drawn it for him, or with him, and that person, whoever they were, had known where the money was buried. And Thomas had no idea who that person was. He'd looked at the map for a long time in the creek bed. He'd turned it over. On the back, in the same architectural hand, were 2 words: "Find Ruth." That was all. Not a name, not an explanation, just a direction. Thomas had followed it. He never found out who had drawn the map. The mystery didn't drive him to obsession. He wasn't that kind of man. But it stayed with him, the way certain unfinished things stay with people who are comfortable with uncertainty. Someone had wanted Ruth Calloway to have that money. Someone had known enough to draw the map and write the direction, and they had trusted, without any evidence that the trust was warranted, that the right person would eventually find the suitcase and follow through. That trust, placed in a stranger who hadn't been born yet, in a chain of events nobody could have predicted, was the most remarkable thing about the whole story. More remarkable than the map. More remarkable than the buried money. More remarkable than the locked suitcase. Someone had trusted the future. And the future, in the form of a careful, calloused-handed man from Pennsylvania who knew how to pick a lock and had a father who believed things belonged to people, had come through. Part 13. The end of Thomas Reel. Thomas Reel ran the Nevada Clarion until 1904, when he sold his share of the paper to Marcus Webb, who had grown into exactly the kind of editor Thomas had hoped he'd become. He retired to a small property outside of Reno. Not large, not grand, just enough land to keep a horse and grow what he needed. He was 61 years old. His hair was fully white. His hands were still calloused and still careful. He died in 1914, in the spring, in a year when the world was about to change in ways nobody in Red Rock Flats in 1882 could have imagined. Ruth Calloway had died in 1901. She'd lived 20 years in the house with the garden. According to the letter Marcus Webb wrote in the Clarion's obituary column, the one Thomas never read because he was already gone, she had kept a photograph of her brother Daniel on the mantelpiece until the day she died. It was the only photograph anyone knew of him. Marcus Webb wrote the obituary for Thomas Reel himself in the summer of 1914. It ran in the Nevada Clarion and was reprinted in 4 papers. It began, "He bought a locked suitcase for $70. He gave away what was inside. He kept the suitcase. Nobody ever quite understood the last part, but everyone who knew Thomas Reel understood the first 2. Part 14. The locked things we pass by. I want to close this story, and I realize we've been riding together for a while, and I appreciate you staying, with the thing that's been underneath all of it from the beginning. The suitcase was falling apart. The lock was seized. The seller laughed. Every single person at that estate sale in Red Rock Flats had the same opportunity Thomas Reel had. They'd all walked past that suitcase in that corner of the barn. Most of them had looked at it. Some of them had probably picked it up, felt the weight, set it back down, and moved on. They moved on because they couldn't see past the damage, the split leather, the missing clasp, the locked and silent exterior. Thomas Reel moved toward it because he had learned, in a locksmith shop in Philadelphia, in a war, in years of careful and solitary travel, that the things worth finding are usually the things that have been made deliberately hard to reach. The question isn't whether you have the skills to pick the lock. The question is, whether you're the kind of person who tries. Every life has a version of the locked suitcase in it. Something overlooked, something dismissed, something sitting in the corner with its price tag and its damage and its silence. Something that everyone around you has decided isn't worth the effort. Whether you walk past it or walk toward it, that's the whole story. That's always been the whole story. And now, one last thing before you go. If you've made it this far, you probably already know you're the kind of person who sticks around for the locked room part of the story, the part where the light gets interesting. So if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, now's the moment, because we have more of these. More buried maps, more cold camp revelations, more strangers who trusted the future, and the unexpected people who came through for them. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, ride with us. You won't regret it any more than Thomas Reel regretted. $70. The images, characters, and events you've seen in this video are an artistic reconstruction created with the help of artificial intelligence. History is messy, incomplete, and open to interpretation. And while we've done our best to honor the spirit of the era and the humanity of stories like this one, the specific characters and events depicted are dramatized for narrative purposes. If you want the real record of the American West, we encourage you to seek out primary historical sources, university archives, and the work of dedicated historians who've spent their lives in the dust with the original documents. The truth, as always, is worth the search.